This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is a returning guest, Nicholas Danforth, senior visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund and a widely respected Turkey watcher. Nick, hello, and thanks so much for joining us.
How are you? Thanks for having me on.
I'm doing pretty well. How goes your quarantine? Are you adjusting well to this new normal?
I'm sitting around reading and writing all day, just like I always did. It's amazing how little has changed.
Ah, interesting. We are speaking on Monday, March 30, precisely 20 days after Turkey reported its first coronavirus case. Turkey is sure to pass the 10,000 cases threshold today, joining only about a dozen other countries that have hit that mark, but of course, with many others to follow. Many have attacked the Turkish government for downplaying the corona threat early on and responding slowly, much like many have attacked the Trump administration, actually. A piece by a Turkish doctor online in the National Interest a couple weeks ago pointed out the flaws in Ankara's approach and the questionable claims of some Turkish officials. Many also agree that, again, similar to Trump and the U.S., Turkey has upped its corona game in the past week or so, taking stronger steps like placing an elderly curfew, calling for a self-declared state of emergency, and suspending all ferry service in Istanbul, which is starting today, and that these steps could, as they say, flatten the curve. You're neither a global health expert nor an epidemiologist, I know, but What's your take on Turkey's corona response thus far?
No, that was exactly going to be my take. It's, A, I'm hardly the person to weigh in on this. B, it seems far too soon to go about evaluating countries based on their corona response. We have a lot more to see about who's done decently. I know it doesn't seem like very many countries have done well. That's certainly true. And again, I think it'll be a while before we get good enough data to figure out what's true, what actually happened. I'd emphasize the points that you made, that in Turkey, much as in the United States, what we have seen clearly is lack of trust in the government, and with that, intense partisanship certainly does not help countries in trying to deal with this. Mm-hmm. When people doubt the government's motives, when people doubt the information that the government is giving them, that makes it hard for them to have faith in the. Say that again. When people doubt the information that the government's giving them, when people doubt the government's motives, it means that even if the governments are doing the right thing, even if the governments are telling the truth, it's not going to have the impact that it should.
Right. Speaking of the government and mixed messages, in his column today, pro-government columnist Abdulkadir Selvi wrote that following a public outcry, the government has altered its plan to release a large number of prisoners to avoid overcrowding and potential health issues. Now, people convicted of sex crimes, violence against women, and first-degree murder will remain in prison. Previously, they were going to be released. They will remain in prison now, along with those accused of terrorism, Selvi wrote. Rights watchdogs are likely breathing a sigh of relief, though there remains the issue that tens of thousands of people, like those linked to the 2016 failed coup, activists and politicians, Demirtas, lawyers, journalists, many more, will remain in prison because they are seen as enemies of the state. Any thoughts on this policy or on the health risks these thousands of seemingly unjustly imprisoned people will face?
As with everything, it seems like if there's something that's bad, then a pandemic hits and it makes whatever was bad more bad. So that, these people shouldn't have been in jail in the first place without due process. And the fact that they're now encountering further medical risks because they're in jail makes it that much worse. I'm not sure what else I have to say about that.
Okay. One last little
corona. No, sorry, I do.
Yeah.
Again, we can debate the benefits of having a mass amnesty in response to the corona pandemic. I think what everyone can agree is that keeping political prisoners who shouldn't be in jail in the first place in jail while releasing sex offenders, yes, that's problematic.
One last little corona question before I get to your recent publication. What did you think of Trump last week comparing his decision to approve social distancing with Erdoğan making a deal with Syrian Kurds, which, of course, in his telling, Trump urged Erdoğan to do and which in reality actually never happened?
Right. It was confusing for a number of reasons. As always, it was difficult to speculate about what Trump actually thought he was talking about. My assumption is that he thought he meant the ceasefire in Syria that Pence and Pompeo went to Ankara to negotiate. The assumption of most analysts at the time was that ceasefire was actually made possible by Russia, not the United States. But that was something Trump at the time took credit for. And my suspicion is that that's what he's turned in his head into some major agreement between quote unquote Turkey and the Kurds that he's claiming credit for. But no, I mean, the irony of that statement was that from Trump's telling, both making peace in Erdogan's case and protecting American citizens from coronavirus in Trump's case were things that, according to him, patriotic leaders resented having to do, but that sometimes they had to. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, whatever agreement he was talking about, the very fact that he says this does say a lot about how he sees things.
Okay, so you wrote a Turkey policy note for the Washington Institute that came out last week and provides a rather thorough overview of Turkey's political landscape right now, looking towards the next scheduled election in 2023. So first, I guess I'll mention Bilal Erdoğan. Poor Bilal Erdoğan, bested by his brothers-in-law, his role with BMZ Group seen as problematic, and I think he's mostly remembered among Turkish people for his squeamish performance on an audio recording released online during the late 2013 corruption scandal in which his father, Erdoğan, I think at the time prime minister, appears to urge him to hide millions of dollars in cash in their home. I was wondering, is Bilal Turkey's Fredo Corleone?
No, there's been a lot of discussion, and part of what prompted this paper is about what the long-term vision of Erdoğan might be. How does he envision handing off the governing apparatus that he's created? How does he imagine building a continuity for his vision for Turkey that will succeed him after he leaves politics? And obviously, one of the sort of default assumption is that he might do this on the succession model. He might have someone inherit the government from him. Obviously, his son, Bilal Erdoğan, or Berat Albayrak, his son-in-law, are two people that have been discussed. In discussions of how Erdoğan might try to engineer a succession, his son, Bilal Erdoğan, has been mentioned. His son-in-law, Berat Albayrak, has been mentioned. Again, for some of the reasons that you mentioned, up until now, Berat has been somewhat of a favorite in this speculation, despite Bilal actually being Erdoğan's biological son. Berat has certainly been trusted with much more higher profile positions, including Minister of Finance and the Economy. And yet what we've seen is the challenges that the Turkish economy has faced and some of the criticism that's been directed against Berat's performance in that regard, as well as, and I'm not trying to speculate, but just acknowledging that there have been now rumors going around about his relationship with Erdoğan's daughter. All of this put together has made Berat seem like less of a favorite. It hasn't necessarily increased anyone's conviction that Bilal is going to be the successor either. And made people now talk about other possible scenarios.
Ibrahim Kalg, the columnist who has blessed the world with a brilliant innovation. Headlines so long and involved, there's no need for the column itself. In his latest piece, he argues that Corona will remake pretty much everything. Nations may switch places, he writes. East may become West. West may become East. Writes Kalg. What in your view is his role in the Erdoğan team, in the Erdoğan circle? What does he provide?
And one of the biggest challenges for outside observers in trying to make sense of what's going on in Ankara is to see, to read columns by people like Ibrahim Kalg, and they're now translated into English, which I don't think has necessarily helped Turkey's image in the West. But to read some of this intensely conspiratorial-laden work and try to figure out how much it represents actual thinking, at the level of the Turkish presidency. And, and you have details like the fact that Kalg is, flies with Erdoğan when he travels abroad. He clearly seems to be taken seriously in some circles. There are other people who've expressed a little bit of skepticism about that or suggested he's fallen out of favor. there's a level of craziness to his particular commentary that I do think is unique, and we shouldn't necessarily read too much into. On the other hand, broad swaths of what he writes, the general worldview of Turkey being besieged by enemies, of Turkey needing to take dramatic diplomatic and often military steps to confront its enemies abroad before they create problems at home, of the linkages that he suggests between Turkey's or Erdogan's domestic enemies and Turkey's enemies abroad. These are certainly seem fairly commonplace and can be found in Erdogan's statements, reports by organizations like SETA, which try to maintain a saner, more respectable face for government commentary. So yeah, I mean, in that sense, I think clearly Karagül is unique, but shouldn't be, the relevance of what he's saying shouldn't be dismissed.
Mm-hmm. Almost maybe he could make Erdogan's position seem reasonable by comparison.
Well, that's certainly true.
In your listing of opposition figures, you gave jailed former HDP leader Selahattin Demirtas pride of place, putting him above Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, who many have pegged as Erdogan's main rival, whenever the next vote takes place. What's the thinking there? Do you see Demirtas as still a more prominent or important figure?
Those weren't ranked in terms of likelihood of defeating Erdogan. Maybe the fact that Davutoglu was at the bottom of the list made it look like there was some kind of prioritization there. That was not our intention.
Okay.
No, I mean, most specifically, the fact that Demirtas is in jail is going to make it difficult for him to serve as a candidate. The fact that he is disliked by a large portion of the Turkish population because of his, because of the HDP and its ties to the PKK. I mean, I'm not predicting, despite what some Twitter commentators suggested, I'm not predicting he's going to win the next presidential race. But he clearly, his performance in past elections shows that he is a formidable person who, in the right circumstances, does command a certain amount of respect and support in Turkey.
I guess if he were to be released, would you see him as more of a rival in 2023 than İmamoğlu?
No. No. I mean, I don't. I think the HDP so far has been relatively savvy about seeing how it can play a role in supporting CHP candidates who are more likely to actually win. I mean, going back to some of the strategic voting that took place for İnce in the 2018 presidential election. You could certainly see that happening again.
Okay. Abdullah Gül, you mentioned him as a political heavyweight and say that he appears to have quietly thrown his weight behind former economic czar Ali Babacan and his new party. Why do you think Gül has been so quiet, though, rather than public in his support for Babacan?
Right, and I mentioned Gül in the context of people having speculated for years about whether or not he would finally stand up and challenge Erdogan, and initially people being very disappointed that he didn't, and then it turning into a running joke that, these elaborate expectations that we're always disappointed about him finally taking on this role. Again, I'm not here to speculate about what's going on in his head. It did seem like he didn't want to make a move unless he was certain it was going to succeed. Whether that's caution or cowardice, the audience can decide. But the other alternative too is that he thought it was important to be able to put a different face. I won't get into that. Leave it where I was.
Okay. Turkey detained 8 more HDP mayors last week and replaced them with appointees. I believe that makes 40 since the local elections just about a year ago now. Your policy brief or note seems to suggest that with this campaign, the AKP government aims to not just take on the Kurdish political and potential security threat, but also to undermine the main opposition, CHP, which was boosted last year by HDP support. Is that right? And if so, please explain that connection.
One of the points I try to make in the paper is that for years, Erdogan and his supporters have accused their opponents of conspiring against them, have suggested that the CHP was in league not just with the Gülenists, but with the PKK, with the HDP, in order to unseat Erdogan. And ironically, despite all these accusations, there have been, as the government knows, deep splits within the opposition over the nature of its relationship, the nature of the CHP's relationship with the HDP and the Kurdish political movement. And this has been a source of a lot of internal disagreement within the CHP between people who think that this outreach is both strategically important and also see a real ideological common cause with people like Demirtas, and people from a more traditional nationalist perspective who are deeply, deeply opposed to the HDP because of its historic ties to the PKK. And so it makes, and so then in the Istanbul election last spring, the HDP and the CHP were able to overcome this disagreement. The HDP supported İmamoğlu, facilitating his victory. They did it, behind the scenes, but they weren't hiding it. And that, the results show that this posed a real risk for Erdogan. Now, on the national level, in a presidential election, that might be much harder to do. But nonetheless, the risk is there. And so in some ways, it makes perfect sense that Erdogan, by cracking down on the HDP, is attempting to break apart this newfound alliance, create a situation where the CHP is then forced to respond to the government's attacks on the HDP, is forced to either condemn them, thereby alienating nationalists within the CHP, or turn a blind eye to them, thereby making it seem to members of the HDP that the CHP is not their ally, that the CHP is ultimately on Erdogan's side in support of his repression of them. So again, so far it seems like these tactics haven't succeeded, that the opposition to Erdogan is strong enough that people on both sides at least say the alliance will continue, cooperation continues. But again, especially when you get to the national level, especially in a national election where national security issues would be more on the table than they were in the Istanbul mayoral race, it seems entirely plausible that techniques like this, an intensified version of it, if you had further fighting in Syria, if you had further fighting in the southeast, that this could be really effective in weakening the opposition alliance.
Mm-hmm. So it's basically a divide and conquer strategy, but they haven't been able to divide the opposition just yet.
Right. But it's something certainly that Erdogan's been very effective at in the past.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You write that pro-Erdogan columnist Abdulkadir Selvi, who I mentioned earlier, recently alleged that the president's opponents had begun plotting for the country's 2023 elections. The project is clear, Selvi wrote ominously, you say. It's a plan to get rid of Erdogan. What does it tell us about Turkish democracy today that electoral strategizing and campaigning is akin to coup plotting?
Right, and I think I also mentioned there's a Karagül column in which he suggested that the results of the Istanbul mayoral election were, quote unquote, a ballot box coup. So again, the same conflation of legitimate democratic opposition and, undemocratic military coups. No, what it says clearly is that there are real risks, and risks that everyone in Turkey has been talking about whether or not Erdogan would be willing to facilitate or accept a democratic outcome in an election that he lost. And what made it, what came through writing this piece, and I hope comes through to people reading it, is that when you look at the trends over the past year, you can see conflicting evidence. You can read Erdogan and his supporters' willingness to rerun the Istanbul mayoral election when they lost as cause for profound concern, as evidence that the Turkey's High Electoral Council is under the government's control, is evidence that the government doesn't respect electoral outcomes and is willing to undemocratically reverse them. But more optimistically, you can also see what happened when they tried to do that, is evidence that there are limits to their power to undermine democratic outcomes. As readers know, the Istanbul elections were rerun at Erdogan's behest. The opposition then won even more dramatically, and there's no evidence that there was any systematic attempt to rig or manipulate the results. And fairly quickly after the results were clear, Erdogan's candidate conceded. So you can see both these trends, and depending on whether you want to be optimistic or pessimistic, to draw conclusions accordingly for what will happen in the next presidential election when the stakes are even higher.
Speaking of before then, I spoke to former Turkish parliamentarian Aykan Erdemir last week, and he expects Erdogan to use the corona crisis as an opportunity to further solidify his power by some draconian measure. Perhaps happened in Hungary, with its parliament essentially voting itself out of existence, as economist correspondent Piotr Zalewski just put it in a tweet. Do you see something along those lines in Turkey? Your policy note seems to suggest a certain level of desperation in Erdogan's circle to avoid a 2023 embarrassment akin to last year's Istanbul rerun vote.
As you say, we've seen governments around the world looking at how they can take advantage of this crisis to consolidate their power. Icon speculation certainly seems on point. How they would do that, what the mechanism would be, that he would be better positioned to speak to that than I would. Especially given, one of the long-term concerns that we've talked about is the economy. Whether or not, no matter how effectively Turkey contains the medical side of the corona crisis, Ankara, like every other government in the world, will face severe economic repercussions. So far, this has been an ongoing, deepening crisis that has never quite reached the dimensions people expect. On one hand, again, you can see different sides of this. Looking back at the Istanbul election, the economy clearly did play a role in increasing voter dissatisfaction with the government. And yet that role was not as dramatic as many people had expected it would be. But if you did see a real, deep, lasting economic crisis coming out of the current pandemic, that would be a threat to the government. And yeah, again, it seems entirely possible they would use that same crisis to try to protect themselves from it in potentially undemocratic ways.
About succession, you write that Erdogan has maintained control of the AKP as president, but as a result, it has now become so closely associated with him that it is difficult to imagine it surviving his departure in any enduring form. You add that the contested succession likely to result from this could further exacerbate Turkey's shift away from liberal democracy and away from the West. It sounds like you're saying that at this point, Turkey's damned with Erdogan and damned without him.
No, and this has been another one of the big long-term debates that people are having that I try to offer some insight into. I'm not sure how much, concrete any of us can really say about it. But I think there are still some people who envision that Turkey after Erdogan will revert to not just its factory settings, but something better than its factory settings. Will revert to a kind of liberal pro-Western democracy that it maybe never fully embodied. I do think the longer the current trajectory continues, the harder that is to imagine. And I say a little bit in my discussion of succession scenarios, the one that a lot of people in the United States clearly hope for is something like, you have elections in 2023, a CHP candidate like İmamoğlu wins, Turkey moves quickly to restore its relationships with the United States, abandon its alliance with Russia, return to a kind of imagined version of secularism, of liberalism, and our bilateral problems go away. And what I worry about, and not just me, is that even if someone like İmamoğlu would win, it's hard to imagine him doing that. And there are a lot of other scenarios for a post-Erdogan Turkey that would be even worse. I mean, that you have fears amongst a number of people that the long-term alternative to Erdogan is not secular liberals, but hardcore right-wing religious nationalists. They might not be Islamists, but they're not going to be the kind of people that liberals in the West want to work with. And I think unfortunately, given how widespread anti-Americanism and anti-Western sentiment is in Turkey, the more contested of given how widespread anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism in Turkey are, the more you have contestations for leadership, the more you have struggles for control of this state after Erdogan, the more it's going to intensify the anti-Americanism on both sides, and the more difficult it's going to make it for anyone who comes to power to pursue a pragmatic or even unpopular course of trying to reconcile with the United States.
But couldn't you see some figures kind of swimming away from that direction, like an İmamoğlu kind of love campaign?
Right. I think you're certainly you could have candidates like İmamoğlu run on trying to minimize domestic divisiveness and trying to promote consensus within Turkey. That still, I think, isn't going to be enough for them to be able to pursue improved relationships with the United States without generating some backlash at home.
Okay. One last question about Syria and Idlib province, where some 2 to 3 million people, displaced people, remain squeezed between Turkish troops and affiliated rebels and the Russia-backed forces of Syrian President Bashar Assad as a fragile ceasefire holds. Erdogan spoke to the leaders of Germany, France, and Great Britain a couple of weeks ago and made no noticeable progress on any agreement for Idlib and the refugees. Turkey seems desperate to not accept any more refugees and indeed hopes to reduce the number it already has. On Twitter last week, you highlighted an argument that in pushing refugees toward the Greek border, as Turkey has in recent weeks, Erdogan was more interested in domestic politics than winning concessions from the EU. And as you wrote in your policy brief, as shown by the intense popular anger towards Syrian refugees, nationalism does not always work in the government's favor. I wonder, how do you see Idlib and the refugee issue playing out? It seems like Turkey's unwilling to give any ground.
Let me step back and try to make a broader point connected with what we were just talking about. This is precisely why I think whatever optimistic, loving rhetoric an opposition candidate uses, they would inherit a lot of the very deep, very intractable foreign policy challenges that the current government has created, and they wouldn't necessarily be able to solve them. I mean, you mentioned the situation in Idlib, where you have Turkey facing a very difficult military confrontation against Assad and Russia, which it feels it needs to take part in to prevent a huge wave of refugees from coming into the country. The opposition has been as, if not much more, anti-refugee. The opposition has been much more anti-refugee than the AKP. And when you look at what JHP candidates say about Syria, they don't necessarily have a coherent answer. They imagine that somehow they'd be able to engage in negotiations with Assad that would make the refugee problem go away. When you look at how committed Assad seems to retaking Idlib, when you look at how committed the people in Idlib seem to not being killed by Assad, it's difficult to imagine how a JHP government could conduct those negotiations in a way that would make the refugee problem go away. Similarly in the Eastern Mediterranean, I mean, the current government has gotten Turkey into a crisis into a showdown in Libya with a range of other countries, connected with a showdown against Greece and the Cypriot government over energy resources in the Eastern Mediterranean. I think you have people in the opposition who'd be happy to drop the whole Libya campaign, who'd be happy to get out of Libya, but they, for their own ideological and practical reasons, are as committed to the conflict over Cyprus, as committed to defending Turkey's claimed maritime rights in the region as the AKP is. So that, as that conflict deepens, again, it becomes harder and harder to imagine how any opposition government could deal with it.
Nick Danforth, Senior Visiting Fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.